They thought the planet would finish him in under a minute. The wind did not howl. It scraped, dragging sheets of metallic dust across the surface at nearly 80 miles per hour, each grain ticking against armor like static that never stopped. And above it all the fleet hung silent and perfect, a line of polished hulls reflecting the rust-red sky. Watching, always watching. At the center of the storm stood Lucas Hale, wrists bound in a restraint field that hummed faintly blue, his shirt torn, skin marked by the cold bite of the air, but his breathing steady, measured, as if the chaos around him was nothing more than weather he had already accepted. Admiral Seraya Thal observed from the command deck, her luminous blue skin catching the glow of the tactical displays, her golden eyes narrowing not with concern, but with calculation, because everything she had studied about humans said this one should already be collapsing, and yet he remained upright, balanced, as if he belonged. Primitive resilience. One officer muttered behind her, a quiet ripple of amusement passing through the bridge, because to them this was not cruelty, it was confirmation, a demonstration that the so-called Deathworld species exaggerated their own legend. Seraya did not laugh, not because she disagreed, but because something about the way he stood felt deliberate. The pressure readings climbed, the atmosphere thickening with reactive particles, a test designed to overwhelm unprotected biology. And still Lucas did not react. He shifted his stance slightly, angled his shoulders into the wind, conserving heat, conserving motion, every adjustment small, efficient, learned. The data scrolled across her screen, vital signs stable, oxygen consumption controlled, and for the first time the numbers did not match the expectation. They told a different story, one not of survival by chance, but survival by design. Release him into Zone C, Seraya ordered, her voice calm, almost curious, and the restraint field flickered off with a soft snap, leaving him free in a landscape that should have pushed him to the ground. But he did not fall. He simply lowered his arms, flexed his fingers once, and looked up, not in defiance, not in fear, just awareness. The fleet's sensors tracked every movement as he stepped forward, boots sinking slightly into the shifting surface, scanning, adapting, as if he had done this before, as if this place was not an execution ground but a problem to solve. Seraya leaned closer to the display, her earlier certainty thinning into something sharper, because the human was not reacting like prey. He was moving like something that understood the rules already, and the most unsettling part was not that he endured. It was that he seemed to choose how he endured, as if the storm, the pressure, the hostile air were variables he had already accepted long before he ever set foot here. And somewhere beneath the quiet hum of the ship, beneath the controlled environment and ordered logic of her world, a thought formed that she did not immediately speak. A thought that lingered as she watched him take another step into the storm without hesitation, without panic, without wasted motion. What if this planet wasn't testing him? What if he had been waiting for it? The sensors followed him as he moved deeper into Zone C, each step slow, deliberate, the storm pressing against him like a living force that never rested. Yet Lucas Hale adjusted without hesitation, angling his body, lowering his center of gravity, conserving energy in ways that looked almost instinctive but carried the precision of something practiced. On the command deck, the ambient hum of systems filled the silence as Admiral Seraya Thal watched the data streams tighten around him, pressure levels rising, airborne toxins fluctuating, temperatures dropping nearly 20 degrees in under a minute, variables designed to destabilize even trained survival units. Yet his vital signs remained controlled, not perfect, but stable enough to suggest intention rather than luck. Increase atmospheric density by 10%, she ordered, her voice even, her gaze fixed, and the command executed instantly. Invisible changes cascading through the environment as the air thickened and the storm gained weight, pressing harder against him, testing his lungs, his endurance, his limits. Lucas paused for a fraction of a second, not to resist, but to adjust, drawing a slower breath, shifting his posture again, as if he could feel the change without instruments, as if his body had already learned to listen to the world around him. One of the officers leaned forward, confusion replacing earlier amusement, because the expected signs of distress were not appearing. There was no collapse, no panic, no wasted motion. Only a steady progression forward, each step measured, each movement efficient. Seraya narrowed her eyes slightly, not in doubt, but in focus, because the pattern was becoming clear. This was not random endurance. This was adaptation in real time, a recalibration happening within seconds, and it did not align with the behavioral models she had studied. The human reached a cluster of fractured rock formations, their edges worn sharp by constant erosion, and without hesitation, he moved behind them, reducing exposure, minimizing wind impact, using the terrain with quiet efficiency. And for a brief moment, the storm no longer struck him directly, the pressure easing just enough to allow recovery. He did not rest. He did not collapse. He simply stood there, breathing, watching the horizon as if mapping it, as if calculating something far beyond immediate survival. He is learning the environment, an officer said quietly, the tone no longer dismissive but uncertain. And Seraya did not respond immediately because she had already reached the same conclusion, only she did not say it out loud. Not yet. Instead, she adjusted the display, isolating his movement patterns, comparing them against predictive models, and the deviation grew with every second, the gap widening between expectation and reality. Lucas stepped out from the cover again, not because he had to, but because he chose to, re-entering the storm with the same controlled pace, the same steady breathing, as if he had already taken what he needed from the shelter and moved on. Seraya felt something unfamiliar settle beneath her calm, not fear, not even concern, but a question that refused to remain silent. Because if he could adapt this quickly, if he could read the environment with such clarity, then the test was no longer measuring his limits. It was revealing something else entirely, something her fleet had not accounted for. And as she watched him continue forward without hesitation, she realized the most unsettling detail was not that he was surviving their world, it was that he was beginning to understand it faster than they ever had. The storm shifted again, not louder, not faster, but different, the particles in the air carrying a faint metallic charge that made the sensors aboard the fleet flicker with low-level interference. And for the first time, the environment stopped behaving like a controlled variable and began acting like something less predictable. Lucas Hale slowed his pace, not out of hesitation, but awareness, his eyes scanning the horizon with a subtle change in focus, his breathing adjusting by a fraction. Deeper, slower, as if preparing for something he had not yet seen but already expected. On the command deck, the displays reacted before the officers did, a ripple of anomalies spreading across the environmental readings, pressure fluctuations that did not align with the programmed parameters, electromagnetic spikes that drifted across the surface like distant echoes, and Admiral Seraya Thal leaned forward slightly, her expression still composed, but her attention sharpened to a precise edge. "Report," she said, and the response came quickly, though not confidently, because the data did not match any of their projections. The system was no longer behaving within defined limits. Something within the planet itself was responding. Lucas stopped near a ridge of dark stone, its surface smooth in some places and jagged in others, shaped by forces that had never been fully mapped, and he lowered one hand to the ground briefly, not touching fully, just close enough to feel the vibration. Beneath the surface, a subtle tremor that most would miss, but not him. He straightened slowly, his posture changing again, less defensive now, more grounded, as if aligning himself with the rhythm of the terrain, and then he moved, not away from the disturbance, but toward it. Confusion spread quietly across the bridge, because the expected response would have been retreat, avoidance, preservation. Yet the human advanced with calm certainty, his path cutting directly into the area where the readings intensified. Seraya studied him closely, replaying his previous movements in her mind, the adjustments, the efficiency, the absence of wasted motion, and a realization began to take shape, not fully formed, but impossible to ignore. Because he was not simply enduring the environment, he was anticipating it. The ground ahead shifted slightly, not collapsing, not breaking, but changing, as if something beneath the surface had altered its state. And Lucas stopped again, his gaze fixed forward, his breathing steady, his body still, waiting. Seconds passed, long enough for the tension on the bridge to build into something tangible, and then the sensors registered it, a rising signature beneath the surface, Not violent, not explosive, but powerful, a presence that moved with deliberate weight, reshaping the readings around it. No one spoke for a moment, because the data alone was enough to command attention, and yet Lucas did not step back. He did not prepare to flee. He simply adjusted his stance once more, as if he had already accepted what was coming. Seraya felt the shift within herself then, the quiet transition from observation to something closer to understanding, because the human had not reacted to the anomaly as a threat. He had responded to it as a known variable, and that difference mattered more than anything the sensors could display. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was lower, more focused than before. "Maintain observation," she said, though the command felt unnecessary, because no one on the bridge could have looked away even if they tried. Below, in the storm, Lucas Hale stood waiting, not for survival, not for escape, but for the next move in a pattern he seemed to recognize before it fully revealed itself. And in that stillness, in that quiet readiness, Seraya understood something that unsettled her more than the shifting planet ever could. The human was not reacting to this world. He was remembering how to move within it. The air grew heavier in a way that no system had predicted, not thicker in density, but deeper in presence, as if the planet itself had shifted its attention, and Lucas Hale did not move away from it. He adjusted, lowering his stance slightly, aligning his balance with the faint vibration that now pulsed through the ground in slow, deliberate intervals. On the command deck, the sensors struggled to categorize the phenomenon, readings fluctuating between geological activity and something far less defined, a pattern that repeated but never perfectly, like a rhythm that refused to be reduced to numbers. Admiral Seraya Thal remained still, her eyes fixed on the live feed, her earlier assumptions now quiet, replaced by a sharper focus that tracked every subtle motion the human made, because each adjustment he executed came before the data confirmed the need for it. Lucas took one step forward, then another, not hurried, not cautious, simply precise, as if he were following a path that only he could perceive. And when the ground ahead shifted again, a slow rise beneath the surface that altered the terrain by inches, he stopped exactly at the edge of it. No closer, no farther, his timing exact. A murmur passed across the bridge, not of fear, but of uncertainty, because the predictive models had not anticipated this level of synchronization between subject and environment, and the gap between expectation and reality was no longer statistical, it was fundamental. Seraya's fingers hovered above the control interface, not issuing new commands, but reconsidering the ones already in place, because what they were observing no longer resembled a test of endurance, it resembled a dialogue, one that the humans seemed to understand fluently. The vibration beneath Lucas intensified briefly, then settled, and he shifted his weight in response, exhaling slowly, his breath visible for a moment before the wind scattered it into nothing. And then he did something that caused the entire bridge to fall silent. He knelt, not in submission, not in weakness, but with deliberate control, placing his hand against the surface this time, palm steady against the shifting ground. The sensors reacted instantly, readings spiking across multiple channels, but Lucas did not withdraw. He remained there, still, listening in a way that no instrument aboard the fleet could replicate. Seconds passed, each one stretching longer than the last, until the vibration beneath his hand began to stabilize, not stopping, but aligning, the irregular pattern smoothing into something more consistent, more predictable. Seraya leaned closer, her gaze narrowing as she compared the incoming data with previous readings. And the difference was undeniable. The environment was changing in response to him, not resisting, not overwhelming, but adjusting. Lucas rose slowly, removing his hand from the ground, his posture returning to neutral, and then he continued forward, stepping directly into the area that moments before had registered as unstable, and nothing happened, no sudden shift, no collapse, only the steady continuation of the storm around him. The realization settled across the bridge without needing to be spoken. The test parameters had not accounted for this possibility, that the subject would not only adapt, but influence the environment itself. Seraya finally spoke, her voice quieter than before, not out of uncertainty, but recognition. "He is not reacting," she said, her eyes never leaving the screen. "He is negotiating." And below, in the endless motion of wind and dust, Lucas Hale walked forward as if the planet had accepted his presence, not as an intruder, but as something it no longer needed to challenge. The storm no longer resisted him in the same way. It moved around him, not parted, not cleared, but shifted, as if the force that once pressed against his every step had begun to acknowledge his rhythm. And Lucas Hale did not slow. He continued forward with that same measured pace, each movement grounded, efficient, deliberate. Above, the fleet remained in formation, but the silence on the command deck had changed. No longer observational, no longer distant. It carried a weight now, a quiet tension that came from witnessing something that did not fit within any known model. Admiral Seraya Thal stood with her hands behind her back, posture composed, but her focus sharpened with every second, tracking not only the data, but the absence of expected reactions, because the environment had ceased escalating. It had stabilized in a way that none of their systems had commanded. "Why has the pressure plateaued?" one of the officers asked, not expecting an answer, because the system log showed no directive, no override, no malfunction. Only a gradual leveling that corresponded exactly with the human's movements. Seraya did not respond immediately. Her eyes fixed on Lucas as he reached another ridge, this one taller, its surface layered in dark mineral bands that reflected faint traces of energy beneath. And once again he did not hesitate. He placed his hand briefly against the structure, not testing, not probing, simply acknowledging, as if confirming something already understood. The readings shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to register across multiple sensors, a decrease in microfluctuations, a smoothing of the irregular spikes that had defined the storm since his arrival. "It is reacting to him," another officer said, the words spoken carefully, as if uncertain whether they should be said at all. And this time Seraya did not correct it, because the conclusion aligned too closely with what she was seeing to dismiss. Lucas moved on, stepping down from the ridge into a flatter stretch of terrain, the wind still present, the particles still striking against his clothing, but the intensity no longer climbed. It remained constant, controlled, as if the environment had reached a limit it no longer needed to exceed. He paused for a moment, lifting his gaze toward the sky, toward the distant silhouettes of the fleet, and for the first time since the observation began, there was a clear connection between subject and observer, not through sensors or data, but through awareness. Seraya felt it, not physically, not in any measurable way, but in the shift of her own perception. Because the human was no longer contained within the parameters of the test, he had moved beyond them, into a space where their control no longer defined the outcome. "Lower the monitoring threshold," she said quietly, not as a command to reduce observation, but to refine it, to capture the details they had previously overlooked, and the systems adjusted accordingly, narrowing their focus, increasing resolution, attempting to understand what had already begun to unfold. Lucas exhaled slowly, his breath steady, his posture relaxed in a way that should not have been possible under those conditions. And then he continued forward, not toward shelter, not toward escape, but deeper into the environment that had once been designed to break him. Seraya watched without interruption, her earlier certainty now replaced by something far more precise, because the question was no longer whether he could survive this world. The question was how long it would take before the world stopped trying to test him at all. And as she observed the storm hold its current state without escalation, she realized that moment might already be happening. The horizon shifted in a way that no longer resembled natural change, not a storm surge, not a pressure wave, but a subtle reorientation of the environment itself, as if the entire landscape had adjusted its balance by a fraction of a degree, and Lucas Hale felt it before the sensors confirmed it, his posture tightening for a brief moment before settling again into that same controlled alignment. He did not stop, but his pace slowed just enough to match the new rhythm beneath his feet. Each step placed with intention, each movement calibrated to something deeper than surface conditions. Above, the fleet's instruments struggled to reconcile the data, readings flattening in some regions while spiking in others, a pattern that defied uniform analysis. And on the command deck the silence returned, heavier now, more focused, because the anomaly was no longer isolated, it was expanding. Admiral Seraya Thal watched the overlays shift in real time, layers of information stacking over one another in an attempt to define what they were witnessing. But the conclusion remained incomplete because the variables were no longer independent. They were responding in relation to a single point on the surface. The field variance is spreading, an officer reported, his voice steady but edged with uncertainty, and Seraya inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement. Without breaking her focus, because she had already seen it, the radius of stabilization widening outward from Lucas's position, not dramatically, not instantly, but consistently, like a ripple that refused to dissipate. Lucas reached a shallow depression in the terrain, its surface smoother, less fractured, and he stepped into it without hesitation, lowering himself briefly to one knee again, not as before, not to test, but to listen, his hand hovering just above the ground as if measuring something beyond temperature or vibration. The wind passed over him, still present, still constant, but its edge had dulled, the abrasive force reduced to something almost manageable, and for a moment the environment seemed to pause, not in motion, but in escalation, as if it had reached a threshold it no longer needed to exceed. Seraya exhaled slowly, a subtle motion that went unnoticed by those around her. Because her attention was fixed on the pattern now clearly forming, the environment was no longer testing extremes, it was maintaining equilibrium, and that equilibrium was centered on the human. He is setting the limit, she said quietly, the words precise, measured, and this time no one on the bridge questioned it, because the data supported the conclusion in a way that could not be dismissed. Lucas rose again, brushing the dust from his hand with a simple motion, and continued forward, not searching, not reacting, but moving with a certainty that suggested the path ahead was already known to him. The sensors tracked every detail, every micro-adjustment, every shift in posture, and the correlation held. The environment responded in kind, not retreating, not yielding, but aligning. Seraya felt the final piece settle into place then, the understanding that had been forming since the first moment he stepped into the storm. This was not a display of resistance. It was a demonstration of control, not over the planet itself, but over his place within it. And as Lucas Hale walked deeper into the landscape that had once been designed to overwhelm him, the realization became unavoidable. The test had not failed. It had revealed something far more significant. The human was not surviving their definition of a death world. He was redefining it. The stabilization that had begun across the surface was no longer a localized phenomenon. It had become a structured field extending far beyond the initial observation zone, and every sensor aboard the fleet now confirmed the same impossible pattern. The environment was no longer escalating or resisting. It was maintaining a steady equilibrium centered entirely on Lucas Hale's position on the command deck. The atmosphere had changed from analytical focus to contained tension because the data no longer behaved like a simulation or a controlled test. It behaved like a system responding to input it had not been designed to recognize. Admiral Seraya Thal stood motionless at the center of the display array, her gaze locked on the expanding radius of stability, which now stretched several hundred yards beyond the human's last recorded position, and still continued to grow at a measured, consistent rate. Lucas moved along the interior of a shallow valley formed between two ridges of fractured stone, his steps unbroken, his posture unchanged, and yet the terrain itself seemed less hostile with each passing second, the wind no longer striking with the same irregular force, the particulate density no longer spiking unpredictably, everything settling into a pattern of controlled flow. Seraya observed the shift carefully, because what she was witnessing was not environmental taming through force, but environmental synchronization, as if the planet was adjusting its own parameters to match the behavior of a single biological presence. Field coherence has reached 700 meters, an officer reported, his voice lower now, less certain than before, and the number itself drew no reaction from the others, because it no longer represented a threshold of containment, it represented expansion. Lucas paused again, not in response to external stimulus, but as if acknowledging a change that had occurred beneath perceptible layers, and he looked down at the ground. Briefly, then forward again, continuing his path without deviation. The sensors captured subtle changes in atmospheric flow around him, pressure, gradients smoothing into gradients that no longer threatened structural instability, temperature variance reducing to within a narrow band that remained consistent regardless of external turbulence. Seraya finally spoke, her voice steady but measured. "He is not resisting the environment," she said, and the statement hung in the air long enough for every officer to register its implication. The environment is adopting his baseline. No one responded immediately because the phrasing challenged every assumption embedded within their operational models, but the data supported it without contradiction. Lucas reached the edge of a wider expanse, where the terrain opened into a vast field of shifting mineral dust, and here the wind should have intensified again, but it did not. Instead, it flowed around him in a continuous, almost rhythmic pattern, as if encountering a boundary that could not be crossed. He stepped forward into the open space, and the response was immediate but subtle, not a reaction of force, but of adjustment, the turbulence flattening within a defined radius, the chaotic motion settling into ordered movement that expanded outward in measured waves. Seraya's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disbelief, but in recalibration, because the implications were now unavoidable. The human was not surviving conditions designed to overwhelm him. He was establishing conditions in which such overwhelming was no longer possible. "Maintain full spectrum observation," she ordered, quietly, and the command was acknowledged without hesitation. But even as the systems complied, the realization continued to deepen across the bridge. This was no longer a test of endurance. It was a demonstration of influence, and Lucas Hale, moving steadily through a transformed environment that now bent around his presence rather than opposing it, had become the fixed point from which all variation was measured. The expansion of the stabilized field had reached a scale that no longer resembled a localized phenomenon, but a restructuring of environmental behavior across nearly 1 mile of terrain, and every sensor aboard the fleet confirmed the same unsettling consistency. The storm was no longer escalating, no longer fluctuating beyond control. It had entered a state of sustained equilibrium centered entirely on Lucas Hale's continuous movement. On the command deck, silence had replaced commentary, because every new data update only reinforced the same conclusion. The environment was conforming to a stable boundary that mirrored his presence with mathematical precision. Admiral Seraya Thal stood at the primary display array, her posture unchanged, but her attention now absolute, tracking the outermost ring of stabilization as it expanded another 100 feet in under a minute without deviation or instability. Lucas continued forward across the open expanse, his movement unbroken, each step placed with the same controlled efficiency that had defined his entire progression through the storm. Yet now there was a difference. The environment no longer resisted him at all. It flowed in response to him, as if recognizing a governing parameter it had not previously acknowledged. The dust patterns across the surface began to align in faint directional currents, not forced, not disrupted, but reorganized into consistent flow lines that extended outward in widening arcs. And the sensors captured it immediately, recording a systemic reduction in chaotic variance across all measured channels. "Field synchronization has exceeded 1.2 kilometers, an officer reported, but his tone carried no emphasis, because the number itself no longer represented escalation. It represented confirmation of a structural shift already underway. Seraya did not respond at first, her eyes fixed on Lucas as he crossed into the center of the widest basin yet observed, where atmospheric instability should have been at its peak, and yet the readings there were now the most stable of the entire grid. He paused, standing still for a long moment, and the environment did not surge against him. It did not test or challenge, it simply held steady, as if awaiting direction. Seraya studied the live feed from multiple angles, comparing historical environmental models against the current behavior, and the discrepancy was absolute, because no known biological or mechanical influence accounted for a system-wide stabilization of this nature. Lucas raised his gaze slightly toward the distant horizon, where the fleet remained suspended above the surface, and for a brief instant the sensor network registered a uniform plateau across all active readings, as if the entire field had synchronized into a single state of equilibrium. "He is not within the system anymore," Seraya said quietly. her voice calm but precise, and the words caused several officers to look toward her. Because the implication of the statement redefined everything they had assumed about containment and observation. Lucas resumed walking, and as he moved, the stabilization followed without lag or deviation, expanding in perfect correlation with his trajectory, not accelerating, not lagging, simply matching. The wind patterns, once unpredictable and layered with turbulence, now moved in consistent directional flows that curved gently around him, never colliding, never destabilizing, as if the environment had established a new rule set centered on his presence. Seraya's expression remained composed, but the focus in her eyes had shifted because what she was witnessing was no longer a test of endurance or adaptation. It was a demonstration of environmental compliance at a scale that should not have been biologically possible. Lucas Hale was not reacting to the death world around him, and the death world was no longer reacting to him in return. Instead, both had reached a state of mutual alignment that suggested a deeper mechanism at work, one that the fleet had not accounted for. And as the stabilized field continued to expand beyond all projected limits, Seraya understood that they were no longer observing survival. They were observing command without command. The stabilization field had now expanded beyond 2 kilometers, forming a perfectly measured radius that no longer behaved like an environmental anomaly, but like a structured system anchored to a single, moving reference point. And Lucas Hale continued forward through its center without hesitation, his presence unchanged in posture or pace, but fundamentally redefining everything around him. On the command deck, the fleet remained silent except for the steady stream of recalibration reports, each one confirming the same impossible condition, that atmospheric volatility, thermal instability, and particulate turbulence had all converged into a unified equilibrium that mirrored his movement with absolute consistency. Admiral Seraya Thal stood at the highest observation interface, her gaze locked on the central projection where Lucas now crossed into the deepest sector of the affected zone, and for the first time since the operation began, there were no outliers in the data, no deviations, no unpredictable spikes, only a continuous and expanding stability field that behaved as if it had accepted a governing logic. Lucas stopped at the center of the basin, a vast open depression surrounded by fractured ridgelines, and there he stood completely still, not in resistance, not in anticipation, but in completion. As if the movement itself had reached its intended endpoint, the environment around him did not collapse back into chaos, nor did it surge forward into escalation. Instead, it remained in sustained equilibrium, the wind flowing in measured currents, the dust circulating in predictable patterns, and the temperature holding within a narrow, unwavering band that defied prior planetary models. Seraya's voice broke the silence, calm, but carrying an undeniable weight of finality. All systems confirm full field integration, and no one questioned the phrasing, because there was no alternative interpretation left to consider. Lucas lifted his head slightly, looking not at the fleet, but through the environment itself, and in that moment the stabilization field reached its maximum recorded boundary, a perfect circular radius extending far beyond initial projections, encompassing terrain that should have remained hostile but now existed in controlled neutrality. The sensors captured the final transition as the system ceased attempting to correct or resist, and instead maintained continuous alignment with the human at its center, as if acknowledging an invariant condition that could no longer be ignored or overridden. Seraya stepped closer to the edge of the display, her reflection faint against the glowing interface, and she spoke again, quieter this time. "It is not adapting to him anymore," she said, pausing as the data updated once more, confirming absolute consistency across all layers. "It has accepted him as the reference state." Below, Lucas Hale remained motionless within the stabilized expanse, surrounded by a world that no longer tested him, no longer opposed him, but simply existed in measured coherence around his presence. And as the fleet observed in complete silence, the realization settled without resistance, not as speculation, not as hypothesis, but as fact, that the human had not survived the death world, nor conquered it, but had become the point from which its chaos was measured, and the last image transmitted from the surface showed him standing alone at the center of a perfectly quiet storm that no longer knew how to break.